The first thing they remembered was the smell. Not smoke, not rot alone, but something older and heavier, like wet bone buried too long and pulled back into air. It clung to the throat. It followed the scream as it tore out of the dark, a sound too thin to be animal and too broken to be human. Somewhere beneath the trees, beneath the mud and tangled roots, something was still alive that should not have been. They said the boy cried before he ever breathed, that when he slid into the world, his mouth already knew how to beg. The women who heard it swore the sound did not rise. It sank, dragging itself down into the earth as if the ground itself were answering back. By the time dawn touched the ridgeline, the hollow was quiet again, but nothing inside it was clean. There are places in Appalachia where the land does not forget, valleys that remember every footstep, every buried name, hollows where bloodlines sink into the soil and feed it until the earth grows thick with inheritance. This was one of those places, a stretch of swamp-fed low ground pressed between hills that leaned inward like ribs. Fog lived there even in summer. Water stood too long. Trees bent away from the center, as if something beneath them breathed upward at night. The child was born into that breathing dark. They never wrote his name down. Names have weight, and weight draws attention. Instead, he was spoken of in fragments. The son, the thing from the wet ground, the boy who smelled wrong. By the time anyone beyond the family knew he existed, his body had already begun to fail him in ways no prayer could reach. If you are listening to this from far away, take a moment now. Which city are you hearing this from, and what time is it where you are? There are hours when stories like this feel closer to the surface, when the distance between your walls and those hills grows thin. Long before the child's birth, before anyone alive could remember, his people had learned to disappear. They learned which paths not to cut, which questions not to answer, which outsiders to turn away with a loaded gun and a steady stare. Records skipped over them. Maps smudged their corner into blankness. Churches marked them as visited without ever writing down who had been saved. What grew there grew inward. Families folded until roles lost meaning. Mothers shared blood with husbands. Brothers learned their lineage only through whispers and silences. Each generation carried less variety than the one before, like copies of copies left out in rain. So when the boy came, twisted and soft and already breaking down, no one was surprised. Fear, yes, shame, maybe, but not surprise. They had seen this shape before, in other infants who never lived long enough to be named. What unsettled them was not how wrong he was, but that he stayed. And as the days passed, and the smell deepened, and the hollow seemed to close tighter around the cabin, it became clear that the land had not finished with him yet. The hollow did not appear on county plats, but it existed long before ink tried to tame it. Old survey notes from the early 19th century mentioned a waterlogged basin of little value, a place where horses sank to the knee, and men learned to turn back without asking why. Settlers skirted it. Traders avoided it. Even the timber crews left the trees standing, claiming the wood split wrong, bled sap that stank, warped after cutting. The land resisted being taken. The family arrived anyway. They came before the roads, before the war, before the state decided what belonged to whom. They built low and close to the ground, cabins crouched like animals sheltering from weather that never fully passed. They learned the swamp's moods, when to hunt the higher ridges, when to let the water rise and take what it wanted. Children were born there and children died there, and the pattern settled into something like law. By the middle of the 20th century, the outside world had crept close enough to be felt but not seen. Radios crackled in distant towns. Trucks passed on roads miles away. Men went to the moon in newspapers that never reached the hollow. Inside the basin, time moved differently. Days were measured by fog thickness, by the sound of frogs at dusk, by whether the creek tasted of iron or rot. The boy grew inside that rhythm. His body did not follow it. He did not crawl like the others had. His limbs resisted him, bending wrong, refusing the simple instructions of muscle and bone. When he was hungry, his mouth struggled to seal, milk leaking out, souring against his skin. Flies gathered. His cries softened into wet, rasping sounds that seemed to come from deeper than his chest. They kept him close at first, hoping warmth might fix what blood had broken. But warmth only worsened the smell. It bloomed around him, sweet and foul at once, like meat left too long near a fire. Family members began to turn their faces away, not in cruelty, in instinct. By his first winter, the elders were already speaking in careful phrases. He would not last. It was better not to let the children see, better not to let the land notice too closely. They had learned over generations that attention invited consequence. The structure they chose for him had once stored food, dug into the slope, lined with timber already softening back into earth. Cool, dark, hidden. It was said the ground there stayed cold even in August, as if something beneath it pulled heat away. They told the mother it was temporary, just until the worst passed, just until the smell faded. She believed them because belief was easier than imagining the alternative. The door closed, the light narrowed, the hollow held its breath. From that point on, the boy learned the world by sound and texture alone, dripping water, scratching claws, the low vibration of footsteps above him that never came down the stairs. He learned hunger as a constant ache and pain as a companion that never left. He learned that when the door opened, it meant survival for a little longer, and when it stayed shut, the dark pressed closer. Above him, life continued as it always had. Below, something was being shaped slowly, terribly by neglect and inheritance and soil, and the land, patient as ever, watched it happen. Years did not pass for the boy the way they passed for anyone else. They pooled, they thickened. Time became something viscous, something that clung to him as he dragged himself across packed dirt and rotting boards. He learned the cellar inch by inch, memorizing its limits with his palms and forehead. 8 steps one way before the wall, 6 the other before the timber bent inward and wept moisture. He marked his world with sores and stains that never fully dried. When the door opened, light spilled in like a foreign substance. It burned. He would turn his face away, not out of fear, but confusion. The dark had taught his eyes to expect nothing. Sound mattered more. He knew the cadence of his mother's breathing when she came. He knew the heavier steps that meant someone else had brought the food and would leave it without touching him. At first she spoke to him, soft words, broken lullabies learned from her own mother. Over time the words thinned. Guilt has a way of eroding language. Eventually there were only motions, a bowl pushed close, a cloth pressed briefly to his skin, the door closing again. Above him more children were born. Some cried like he had, some did not. The ones who did not last were wrapped and buried quickly, their graves marked with stones that sank back into the swamp within a season. The ones who lived learned not to ask questions. They were warned about the thing beneath the ground, told it would grab their ankles if they wandered too close, told it had once been a boy but was no longer anything they should recognize. They believed this easily. Children always do. Sometimes, at night, the swamp carried his sounds farther than intended. A long moan when pain flared too sharply, a wet cough that seemed to come from inside the hill itself. Neighbors, if they could be called that, heard it from miles away and told themselves it was wind through cypress knees or animals dying where no one could see them. The boy did not understand fear as they did. He understood only need. When hunger sharpened, he scraped at the door until his fingers split. When pain overwhelmed him, he rocked until his muscles spasmed. He made marks on the dirt with a stick he had found, repeating the same shapes without knowing why. Circles within circles, lines that crossed and crossed again. The shapes of something folded too tightly. As his body changed, the smell deepened. One leg darkened, then hardened, then lost feeling entirely. The flesh did not behave as flesh should. It lingered, it refused to let go. Flies laid eggs that hatched and fed and were brushed away and returned again. Infection became constant, an invisible tide that never fully receded. The adults spoke less about him as time went on. Silence felt safer than acknowledgement. He became part of the hollow itself, another feature like the creek or the sinkhole that opened after heavy rain. You stepped around it. You did not name it. Then one day, a voice he did not know drifted down the stairs. It was calm, curious, wrong. A man had come into the hollow from the outside, following rumors older than facts. He stayed long enough to notice the smell rising through the floorboards, long enough to hear what could not be explained away as weather. When he asked, The room fell quiet in a way that told him the answer mattered. That night, the boy heard footsteps stop at the top of the cellar stairs, and did not know that the world above him had begun to crack open. The stranger did not descend at first. He stood at the threshold, lantern held low, listening. What came up from the darkness below him was not a single sound, but a layering of them, breath moving through ruined lungs, the faint scrape of bone against earth, a wet, rhythmic noise that suggested something alive was still trying to arrange itself into comfort. When the light finally tipped downward, it revealed only fragments, a hand curled wrong, skin that reflected yellow instead of pink, eyes that did not track the flame but flinched from its warmth. The man closed the door without a word. Some things cannot be unlearned once fully seen. He stayed the night anyway. By morning, he had pieced together enough from half-sentences and nervous silences to understand that what lay beneath the cabin was not an animal, and not a punishment from heaven, but a consequence. One bow. RN of blood turned inward too many times. He spoke of help, of doctors, of places where children like that could be kept clean and warm and alive without being hidden. The patriarch listened without interrupting. Then he explained patiently that help was another word for exposure, that once light touched what had grown in the hollow, it would not stop at the cellar door. It would move through the family, through the land, through everything they had kept intact by staying unseen. The stranger left with that understanding lodged somewhere behind his eyes. He carried it with him back to towns where roads were marked and births were counted. He wrote it down once, years later, in a notebook that no one read until after his death. Even then, the names were missing. The place was only described as a basin that breathes. Life below the cabin continued. The boy's body folded further in on itself. Muscles shortened, joints locked. His world shrank until even crawling became an effort that cost more than it gave back. But there were changes that could not be ignored. He reacted to voices now, turning his head toward them. He made new sounds, sharper ones, as if something inside him had learned to demand instead of endure. Above, the children dared each other to touch the cellar door. One swore he felt it move. Another claimed to hear words in the moaning. None of them were punished for spreading these stories. Fear served the family better than discipline ever could. Then, the eland shifted. Logging crews began cutting closer to the basin, their machines tearing into hills that had never been opened. The ground vibrated differently. New smells mixed with the old. One afternoon, a man strayed too far from his team and followed a scent he could not place until it led him straight into the hollow. What he saw there did not resemble poverty or illness as he understood them. It looked like a mistake that had learned to survive. He ran. Within days, uniforms followed the path his panic had carved through the woods. Horses balked at the edge of the swamp. Men argued about jurisdiction and responsibility. When they finally reached the cabin and demanded entry, the family scattered like animals flushed from cover. Only the mother stayed. She emerged carrying the boy against her chest, his head lolling, his body lighter than it should have been. The smell hit the officials before the sight did. Some turned away. One retched, another crossed himself without realizing it. The boy opened his mouth and screamed at the sky. It was the first time the hollow had hurt him above ground, and the sound carried farther than anyone expected. They did not understand the shape of the family until they tried to explain it on paper. Lines crossed and doubled back. Names appeared more than once in the same generation. A man was listed as both father and uncle, a woman as mother and sister. The tree did not branch. It collapsed inward, ring after ring tightening arrow. Under single point. When the truth surfaced, it did so without ceremony. No confession, no dramatic admission. Just quiet answers given under pressure, spoken the way one might recite the weather. Marriages between cousins, births from unions that had no language left to describe them. Children raised without ever knowing where one role ended and another began. The boy was not an anomaly. He was an accumulation. Doctors later said his body had been carrying too many identical instructions, the same errors copied again and again until nothing could compensate for them. Systems that should have supported each other failed together. Waste built up where it should have been filtered out. Tissue died and stayed, stubbornly refusing to detach. He had been decaying while alive, a process that began before he ever drew breath. The mother listened as this was explained to her, in words she only half understood. She nodded because nodding was expected. When asked why she had allowed him to be kept underground, she said she had done what she was told. When asked who told her, she looked at the ground and said everyone. The removal was quiet. No one fought when the boy was lifted onto the stretcher. The patriarch stood on the porch and watched, his face set in something like relief. The children hid. The swamp swallowed the sound of hooves as the party left, carrying the Hollow's secret with them for the first time in generations. In town, the story changed shape with every telling. Some said the family had worshipped the child. Others claimed he had been fed blood. A few insisted he was not human at all. Photographs circulated briefly, then disappeared. Reporters arrived and were turned away. Ministers preached sermons without naming names. What remained constant was the sense of contamination. The house was burned within a week. Animals were slaughtered. Graves were left unmarked. It was easier to erase than to understand. Easier to believe the fire could cauterize what had been allowed to grow. The boy was taken to a place with white walls and steady light. Machines hummed around him. People touched him without fear, gloved and careful, as if proximity itself might harm him further. He did not know where he was. He knew only that the ground no longer breathed beneath him. For a time, he lived. He gained weight slowly. His skin lost some of its grey. The smell faded but never vanished completely. There were moments when his fingers tightened around a hand that was not his mother's, moments when his breathing steadied in response to voices he recognized. These moments were recorded, measured, catalogued, but the damage had been too thorough. Systems failed in sequence. When one stabilized, another collapsed. His body could not escape the inheritance written into every cell. He died without ever returning to the Hollow, without ever knowing what his existence had cost. Years later, when a researcher sifted through hospital archives and county record, the case stood out not for its rarity but for its inevitability. A child shaped by isolation, a family preserved too perfectly, a place that had been allowed to turn inward until it produced something that could not survive light. The file ended with a single note in the margin, written by a hand that had shaken slightly. This did not begin with him. The records did not rest easily. They sat misfiled in county basements, hospital storage rooms, church archives that smelled of mildew and candle smoke, folders without photographs, photographs without names, births recorded years after they happened, deaths listed without causes, entire families reduced to margins and footnotes. Anyone could have missed them. Most did. In the late 1980s, someone did not. She was not looking for the boy. Not at first. She was tracing abandoned settlements for a regional history project, cataloguing places that had emptied without explanation. Ghost towns, forgotten hollows, communities that vanished between census years. One location kept reappearing without ever fully resolving into a dot on the map, a basin marked, then unmarked, a creek named, then scratched out, property transfers that ended abruptly in the mid-1960s. When she asked locals, they grew vague, said the land was bad, said people there had been strange, said it was better not to go looking for trouble that had already burned itself out. She went anyway. The hollow had healed itself poorly. Trees grew back twisted. The ground stayed soft even in dry months. Old nails surfaced after rain, rusted into shapes that resembled bone fragments. She found the stone outline of a foundation, blackened at the edges, and a depression in the slope where a doorframe had once held back earth. She smelled it before she understood what she was standing over. Back in town, she requested Ho. Spittle archives from 1965 to 1967. One file was thicker than the rest. The handwriting inside shifted from clinical precision to something closer to confession. Charts tracked a child who should not have lived as long as he did. Notes described deterioration without precedent. Photographs, sealed separately, showed a body reshaped by confinement and genetic collapse. The family history took longer. Genealogies that refused to resolve, baptismal records listing the same surnames in circles, marriages performed without witnesses, children baptized twice because no one could remember if it had already been done. When she finally reconstructed the lineage, She understood why no one had wanted to see it clearly. The family tree did not simply show incest. It demonstrated endurance, a closed system surviving by refusing outside influence, long past the point where survival became harm. She interviewed one of the younger relatives, now middle-aged and living under a different name. He spoke carefully, as if every word had weight. He said they had not known any other way, that the world beyond the hills had felt unreal, like a story told badly. He said the boy had frightened them because he showed them what they were becoming. The researcher wrote her paper without sensational language. She avoided photographs. She focused on isolation, on the consequences of communities left to fold in on themselves. When it was published, it drew little attention outside academic circles. The Ald had moved on to louder horrors, but she kept thinking about the cellar, about a child who learned the limits of existence by crawling them in the dark, about how long suffering can persist when no one is looking directly at it. In her notes, never published, she wrote a single line that circled back again and again. "Some families don't collapse," it read. "They condense." By the time the paper circulated, the town had already decided what it would remember and what it would let sink. The fire had done its work. The cabins were gone. The hollow was marked as unsafe land, unsuitable for development, quietly left alone. People drove past the turnoff without slowing, feeling something tighten in their chest without knowing why. The church records told a different story than the sermons ever had. Meetings were held in back rooms, names were prayed over and never spoken aloud again. There had been anger when the truth surfaced, but it was not the righteous kind. It was fear wearing the shape of judgment, fear the rot was not contained, fear that the bloodlines of the hollow might reach farther than anyone wanted to admit. Animals were killed not for mercy, but for cleansing. Hogs, dogs, goats, anything that had lived too close to the basin was put down and buried deep. Some said it was to stop disease. Others said it was to quiet dreams. The ground was salted in places where nothing had ever grown well to begin with. No one held a service for the boy. He existed in records, in hospital rooms, in photographs locked away, but not in collective mourning. To acknowledge him fully would have meant acknowledging complicity. The silence was easier. Silence always is. Years passed. Children grew up hearing fragments. A burned house, a bad family, a place you don't go. The details blurred into folklore, stripped of their human center until the story became safer to carry. Monsters are easier than victims. But sometimes, late at night, people still dreamed of the smell, of damp air rising from below floorboards, of a sound that wasn't quite crying but wasn't anything else either. The researcher returned once more in the early 1990s. She stood at the edge of the hollow and watched Fogpool where the cellar had been. She did not go down into it. She understood then that some places are not meant to be excavated, only acknowledged. Before she left, she recorded a final note on her tape recorder. Her voice was steady, but quieter than before. "This wasn't about cruelty," she said. "It was about inheritance, about what happens when secrecy is passed down like a virtue, about what grows when isolation is mistaken for purity." She never returned again. The land reclaimed itself in layers: leaves, mud, roots, the depression where the cellar door had been finally filled in. If you walked over it now, you would not know a child had learned the shape of suffering there. You would not know that something had once lived in the ground long enough for the ground to accept it. But the story did not end with the hollow. Stories like this rarely do. They echo outward, into questions people avoid asking themselves, about family, about origin, about what might be buried just beneath the narratives we tell to keep ourselves intact. And sometimes those echoes surface in the quiet moments, when you are alone and thinking about where you come from, and what parts of that inheritance were never meant to see light. There are questions that arrive too late to save anyone. They come after the fires have cooled, after the records have been boxed and shelved, after the people who could answer them have already learned how to stay silent. This was one of those questions. What would have happened if someone had gone into the hollow earlier? If a road had cut closer? If a school census had reached farther? If a doctor had followed the smell instead of turning away? It is tempting to believe the outcome would have changed. That light, introduced sooner, might have undone what darkness had shaped, but the truth is less comforting. The boy was not only hidden by geography. He was hidden by tradition, by fear, by a collective decision repeated across generations that survival meant separation, that anything beyond the hills was a threat greater than what was already unfolding inside them. By the time anyone saw him clearly, his fate had already been written cell by cell. In the years since, other hollows have been found, other families living just far enough outside notice to collapse inward, other children born carrying too much sameness, too little chance. Their stories rarely make records. They surface briefly, then disappear again, absorbed back into the quiet places that produced them. The land does not judge these outcomes. It absorbs them. It takes the bodies, the houses, the names, and folds them back into itself. Roots break bone down to calcium. Water carries memory away molecule by molecule. Eventually, all that remains is a feeling, a heaviness in certain places, a sense that something there should not be disturbed. The boy from the swamp did not know words like lineage or consequence. He did not understand why his body failed him, or why the dark became his world. He knew only touch, hunger, pain, and the brief relief of a door opening. His life was not a lesson to him. It was simply existence, endured as long as it could be. The lesson belongs to those who come after. It lives in the way we look at our histories and decide which parts to confront and which to bury. It lives in the story. Families tell about themselves, and the silences they defend most fiercely. It lives in the uncomfortable truth that harm does not always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from preservation taken too far. If you were to uncover something like this in your own bloodline, something folded away and left to fester, what would you do with it? If you learned that the person who raised you was bound to you in ways never meant to be spoken aloud, would you expose it to the light, or would you protect the darkness that kept it hidden? The mountains still hold their hollows. The ground still remembers what it has been fed, and some stories, once unearthed, do not ask to be judged or shared. They ask only to be acknowledged, because the past is never gone. It is only waiting, patient and unchanged, for the moment someone finally looks down and sees what has been there all along.